Well, good evening, everyone. Happy April 1st. We took care of all of the foolishness before class, so as far as I can tell, everything that I'm going to tell you tonight will actually be true, so rest assured. So we're in chapter 8 tonight. It's on propagation, and it's all about figuring out how signals get from one end from your shack to the person you're talking to, hopefully across the world. And coming up on passing your general exam, you'll have access to the HF frequencies. So the focus on propagation will be primarily on HF propagation. When we get to the extra class in the fall, we'll get into some other modes of propagation, some strange stuff, but tonight it'll be HF. And propagation is a little bit like electricity in that you don't really see electricity working, but the effects are dramatic. And propagation is very much the same way, especially when it comes to bouncing signals off the ionosphere. So we'll answer the question, how do we get from here to there? And jump right into it. So there's basically three ways that signals can get from one place to another. Here's a transmitting station, receiving station. Either you can go line of sight from one antenna to the other. That's called space wave. Then we've got ground wave, where the signals will actually hug the ground. This shows it in kind of a straight line. It actually curves a little bit following the ground. That doesn't go very far, but we'll mention it. And then we've got skywave, which we'll be primarily talking about tonight. Skywave is also called skip. The signal goes up into the ionosphere and returns to Earth after refraction from the layers in the upper atmosphere. And we can skip multiple times, get all the way around the world that way. So the ionosphere will be the central theme of the chapter. But first of all, I need to show you something. Here we've got, if you ever wondered what the ionosphere was, now you know. It's a bus.
It's a big bus.
It's a big bus. There's actually a tour company. They were out of Anderson. As far as I know, they still are. But I saw this parked, and I just had to take a picture. And the power lines over the top kind of look like an antenna, but they're power lines in the background. So that's our ionosphere. It says, anybody want to come along for the ride? And that kind of reminds me of a story. I was in church one time, and there was a very inquisitive little girl, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, and I was getting ready to walk out the door, and she looked at me funny and said, where are you going? And without missing a beat, I told her, well, I'm going crazy. Would you like to come along? And she looked at me with a real serious look on her face and said, oh, I'll have to ask my mom first. So hopefully you won't have to ask your mom if you can go for a ride on the ionosphere bus. So it begins about 30 miles above the Earth, goes up to about 300 miles. So it's well above the air we breathe. And the way that it works, ultraviolet light and X-rays from the sun are what are called ionizing radiation, and they actually have enough energy to knock electrons off molecules, gas molecules in the upper atmosphere. That results in free electrons floating around, and what's left on the other side of the atom, of course, is an ion, positive ion. So that's what makes that work. And radio signals are then refracted by the electrons that are up there. So refraction normally happens when there's a change in density, and in this case we're talking about a change in electron density, the amount of electrons. So between the different layers, which we're going to be getting into, the density of the electrons changes, which causes the refraction effect to the point where you can actually refract a signal off of this ionized gas, or actually the electrons that are results of it. So here's a scale diagram. I had a friend that brought in a globe once to a ham club meeting, and it was a globe, and he had playing cards stuck to the outside of the globe. And his point was that gives us an idea of the scale. The ionosphere is very, very close to the edges of the Earth when you look at the Earth all the way across. This one is even exaggerated, because 300 miles compared to 8,000 miles, it's just, it's practically on the line here. Note here that the space station orbits around 250 miles, so it's actually inside the ionosphere. And the distance, Earth's diameter, is about 8,000 miles. Okay, that's all the way around. And if you remember the formula for circumference, it's pi times d. So we wind up with a distance around the Earth of about 25,000 miles. So if it's 25,000 miles all the way around, halfway around the Earth is about 12,500 miles. So we're not going to be talking about moon bounce tonight, but if you think about it, if we were looking down from the moon can see half the circumference of the Earth, or 12,500 miles. So it kind of gives you an idea of some of the distances involved. And the ionosphere breaks down into regions. I think we touched on some of this in the technician class. But on the sun side of the Earth, here's the sun. The ionosphere forms very specific regions. The lowest region is the D region. Then we have the E, the F1 and F2 regions. And then on the night side of the Earth, in the absence of sun, the F layers combine into a single layer, and the D and E disappear. So it's not as perfect as it's shown here. Anything that you see in terms of diagrams describing these regions has nice round circles. The ionosphere is actually very messy, and it gets all scrambled up, especially when it goes from daylight to night. There's another concept here that we won't get into in the general class, but the terminator between light and dark, see the straight line here? That's called the gray line. And propagation can be very excellent along the gray line. There's ways of predicting when that will occur, just introducing that concept. So here's some relative distances. Here's our space shuttle up here, up at the top of the ionosphere. The distances, D, E, F1, F2. We start about 30 miles. And here we've got Mount Everest. Mount Everest is about 29,000 feet, which is about 5.5 miles. So we're well above that, where the D layer forms, or the D region. Commercial airliners typically fly at 6 to 8 miles above sea level. So we can see that they're well out of the way as well. So ultraviolet and X-ray, I mentioned what's called ionizing radiation. It's very strong. If it wasn't for the ionosphere, that ionizing radiation would make its way to Earth, and of course that would be cancer causing. So the ionosphere protects us from that ionizing radiation. The D layer is the lowest. The molecules are the most dense at that point, and that's the place when the D layer becomes ionized. It tends to absorb lower frequency radio signals from the Earth. So some people have equated the D layer to the destructive layer, meaning that at certain frequencies it will absorb the signal and there will be no propagation. 80 meters is pretty dismal during the day, for example. And that's because of absorption. D region, and there's places where you can go to sleep during my presentation and places where you really shouldn't go to sleep. When you see blue text, pay attention, because that'll be a pool question. It's okay if you go to sleep during the black text, but the black text will help you make sense of the blue text. So I'd recommend not going to sleep at all, because you might not wake up in time. So,
making fun of me.
Say again?
Are you making fun of me?
Of course. It's fun. All right, let me continue. So the D region absorption increases in the daytime when the UV is more intense, enemy of low frequency propagation. That's why 160 and 80 are pretty well dead during the day when the sun is shining. It's the most absorbent of signals during the daylight hours, below 10 megahertz. That would be 40 meters, 80 and 160. And some of the signals may be completely absorbed. Put a little arrow here showing where it is. A little hard to read this, but it's the lowest layer. A little bit more. So the specific bands that are affected. More blue text here. Long distance communication on 40, 60, 80, and 160 can be difficult because the D region absorbs these frequencies during daylight hours. Kind of mentioned that, but here it's in context of the pool question. The E is the next layer up. Okay, it's 60 to 70 miles above the Earth. It develops during the day and disappears at night. And as we go higher and higher within the ionosphere, the gases that are there become less and less dense. So it does tend to last a little bit longer after sunset, but it disappears at night. Being higher than the D region, we get a longer hop. The E region can hop up to about 1,200 miles from your transmitter up to the ionosphere, being the E region in this case, and then back down to Earth, 1,200 miles away. There's some really unique propagation modes within the E layer. We'll only touch on a couple of these tonight. There's something called E-skip, meteor scatter, which is fascinating. There's something like, there's hundreds of thousands of meteors that enter our atmosphere here on Earth every day. Some of those are just the size of a grain of sand, and others are a little bit bigger. But trailing those burning meteors, even if they're a grain of sand, is an ionized layer that can actually reflect radio signals. That's what meteor scatter is all about. It's effective. Most people use 6 meters when they're playing with that. I've not played with it yet, but I want to. And then there's some enhanced VHF propagation near the poles that is an effect of ionization in the E layer. We will talk about that tonight. The F region is the highest, splits into 2 halves during the day, F1 and F2. And then at night it combines into a single layer. And it varies with the time and the season, latitude, solar activity. Like I mentioned before, it isn't always these nice, beautiful circles around the Earth. There's a lot of things that will tend to squish those things around. So the longest single hop in the F region is about 2,400 miles. So the higher the region, the further the hop. It's a little bit like a pool table. If you are back from the edge, the ball can make it to the far side of the table easily. In this case, the higher we are in the layer, the further it can come down on the other side, depending upon the angle that you poke the radio signal up to. So the stronger the sun's illumination, the higher the F2 region. So that would normally happen in the middle of the day, noonish, early afternoon. And here's kind of an interesting picture, and a lot of concepts come out here. There's an analogy, because we're talking about refracting radio waves here. We see that a radio wave goes up. It's not really reflected, but it's bent, it's refracted, and depending on the frequency and the angle of incidence, it can come back down to Earth in a hop or a skip. So that's analogous to light coming through a prism. The lower frequency light components, violet in this case, bend more than the higher frequencies. So it's the same basic effect as a radio signal encounters a difference in electron density. We get refraction in with light, which I think we've all seen in our science classes in the good old days. We have this effect. So here's a picture of a simulation of radio waves coming in at 1 electron density. Then there's a boundary here where there's a more dense or less dense. It works both ways, and that causes the signal to refract. So this isn't a great analogy, but it'll give you a rough idea. There's another concept that is implied here that we're going to get to later tonight, and that's the concept of critical angle and critical frequency. So critical angle is shown here. If we're shooting a signal up, and these would be signals in this case that are all on the same frequency, we'll try pointing our antenna this way, and it doesn't refract enough to come back to Earth. But at an angle called the critical angle, that's just low enough where there's enough refraction for it to bend, come back down to Earth. And then there's another concept called, well, that's maximum usable frequency, because if you go higher than the maximum usable frequency, it'll go off into space. We'll also be talking about the lowest usable frequency. And those are signals that wind up being absorbed in the D layer. We'll talk a lot more about that in a little while. Just wanted to introduce the concept at this point. So a little bit more on radio wave refraction. In the picture here, we've got basically a virtual mirror. It's as if the signal went up and hit the mirror and came back down. What was really happening is that it's bending and then coming back down. It's called refraction. So the degree of refraction has to do with how strong the region's gases are ionized and the radio frequency, as we saw previously. UHF signals will pass right up into space. They don't get refracted hardly at all. So you almost never get any ionospheric interaction with VHF and UHF frequencies. A little bit more here on critical angle and critical frequency, but this time in context of the pool questions. And there's two pool questions that relate to critical angle and critical frequency, and it can be very confusing. Let me read this first. Critical angle is the highest takeoff angle that will return a radio wave to Earth under specific ionospheric conditions. If you go any higher than that, it'll go off into space. Now, you're probably wondering, why do I have bold italics on the word highest? Well, the two pool questions, unless you're thinking, you know, am I above the frequency? Am I below the frequency? Is it highest? Is it lowest? That can be confusing. But if you look for this word, highest, that's my little shortcut. And both highest and lowest appear in the answers. So when you see highest, that's going to be the right answer. There's another one that's very similar to that. So it's critical angle, the highest takeoff angle. Critical frequency at a given incidence angle is the highest frequency at which it is refracted back to Earth. So it's easy to get these backwards, but if you just look at the word highest, you'll be able to pick out the right answer. So how do we know what the critical frequency is? Well, there's an instrument called an ionosonde that the universities and government entities have. It is basically an upward firing radar, and it sweeps a frequency. It sends pulses at different frequencies. Here we're showing 1 megahertz, 2 up through 7, and then here we're seeing distances in kilometers. So we're going to shoot a 2 megahertz frequency straight up signal, and if it comes back down again, that'll be an indication on our radar that something is returning that signal. So that's how we can identify the E layer. We get up to a higher frequency, we can see that we're into the F layer. And notice there's an F, there's two of them, F2, red and green. Something very interesting happens in the F layer, and that's if you shoot a signal up into the F layer, it breaks into two parts, something called an ordinary wave and an extraordinary wave. And they can actually go off in different directions. Very freaky stuff, but that's what we're seeing here. And so an ionosonde will give us an ionogram, which is what we're looking at here, a simplified version, giving us those concepts. And I mentioned that we get refraction due to change in density in a medium. And here's another ionogram shown a little bit differently. This time we're looking at free electrons per cubic meter, and we see how there's breaking points here. Breaking point at D, and then we have another breaking point at E, and then another breaking point going the opposite direction that defines the F layer. So day and night, they act a little bit differently. But it's those differences in electron density that is causing the refraction. And here's one that's a little bit more technical. Let me point out what's going on here. Here we've got our F layer, the radar return that's coming back. But up here, we've got one that's the same distance from the bottom, but it's fainter. What's happening is the signal is coming up and being reflected back down from the F layer, comes to Earth, then it bounces off the Earth and goes back up again, and so we're seeing a ghost echo of this. There's a bunch of links here. If this is of interest to you, these are excellent links. Kastler has one on the Ionosonde, and this one you don't have to be an ARRL member to see. There's a YouTube video, a couple of other sources. So if this is of interest to you, go ahead and give some of these things a quick look. I did go through this entire presentation today and made sure that all of the links worked, so that's always something that we can't depend upon from one year to the next.
And just a reminder, that'll be at the Dropbox link that's in the description of this video and on YouTube. This description box on YouTube will have that link, and those will be all available as PDFs tomorrow.
Yep, tomorrow morning. Yep, Gary normally gets up very early in the morning and gets all of this stuff processed. I'm more of a night owl, so I'm glad that he does that. So yes, all of these links will work. So let's talk just a little bit about Groundwave. I mentioned Groundwave hugs the ground. We have a difference in density here. Again, that's what you need for refraction. So the difference in density, we've got the ground, which is denser than the air above it. So the signals tend to hug the ground. They're actually bending toward the ground. Groundwave doesn't go very far. I think I've got a chart of that coming up. Might be 30 miles if you're lucky, depending on the frequency. So here we've got ground waves, so it'll only go out, I'll just say 30 miles for the sake of this illustration. It'll go out to 30 miles. So if you're between my transmitter and within this 30-mile range, you'll be able to hear me. The other way that you can hear me is if my signal goes up into the ionosphere and then comes down at some distant location. And here we've got two different angles of incidence. Angles being shot up into the ionosphere, so we're coming down at two different points. The distance between where the ground wave ends and where the skip or hop comes down from here to here is called the skip zone. You can't hear anything in the skip zone because in this case the signal has petered out, ground wave. In this case it hasn't come back down to Earth yet, so there's no signal in the skip zone. We're going to see an exception to that coming up a little bit later. But the concept of the skip zone is what I wanted you to pick up on. And Kastler had a pretty good description of this in his introductory video. So talk a little bit more about how these things move. Hop is one reflection or refraction from the ionosphere. Skip, which is skywave propagation. Higher the reflecting region, the longer the hop. We mentioned that already. We already mentioned that the maximum distance along the Earth's surface in one hop of the F2 region is 2,500 miles. And the F2 region is responsible for the longest distance propagation because it is the highest ionospheric region, like the pool table example. Now this almost seems like there's an all of these answer coming, but these are all separate pool questions, so that's not the case here. Approximate maximum distance along the Earth's surface covered in one hop of the E region is 1,200 miles. Notice that the E region is about half the distance of the F2 region. And then ground wave, as we said, is propagation along the Earth's surface. The skip zone we've talked about already. Notice that these are labeled as rays, ray 1, ray 4, etc. These diagrams kind of imply that we've got laser beams being shot out of our transmitter. It's actually more like a flashlight beam. And of course, a flashlight beam is pretty broad. I mean, you have focused flashlight beams, but they still cover a fairly large area. So I guess you could say that these rays would be the peak intensity of the RF, but it's actually kind of a wide area. The further you get, the wider it disperses. Now ground wave, reason that it's so short is it's limited by ground losses. The ground absorbs RF, the very good absorption properties. Sky wave goes up, comes down at a distance. We already talked about the concept of a skip zone where you're not going to be hearing anything. So there's often no communication possible in the skip zone. we've got an exception coming up a little bit later. I know we've talked about some of this already, but repetition is one of the keys to memory, so we'll keep covering it. Here's a little bit bigger picture. Then we have a concept called multi-hop, where traced in red here, should actually be curved up here rather than a point, but you get the idea. It'll go up to the ionosphere, it'll come down, then it'll bounce off the Earth, go back up, come back down again. So single hop here, multi-hop there, and you can actually hop all the way around the Earth. Concept of long path and short path. This is interesting. So we said before the circumference of the Earth is about 25,000 miles. We're going to talk about Senegal, Africa to Italy. Now the distance between these two stations on the surface of the Earth is about 2,480 miles. Now if we're talking about beam antennas and you reverse your beam to 180 degrees away from the person you're talking to, the signal will go all the way around the Earth the other way and reach that person, maybe if conditions are right. So the person you're trying to talk to might be in the skip zone via short path, but would not be in the skip zone necessarily long path. So, and the key to remember, to make a long path contact, point your antenna 180 degrees from its short path heading. This is kind of a mind bender, but it really happens. So if the short path comes down, is in the skip zone, be no communications. And Gary shared last time a story about a friend in Montserrat. Do you want to share that again, Gary?
Sure. Yeah, my friend, mic on, please. Thank you. My friend Greg, whose stateside call is K8GL. Hi, Greg. I saw he was on the CQ Worldwide WPX contest this weekend. Well, he went down to Montserrat and was licensed down there. I remember the call, Victor Papa 2, Mike United. And we had made a schedule that I would give him a call from, I was living up in Saginaw, Michigan, and had a 3-element Yagi. And so I pointed it to the southeast down toward Montserrat, and I called him, and I called him, and I called him, nothing. And on a whim, I said, I'm going to try long path. And so I rotated the antenna 180 degrees, gave him a call, he came right back.
Yep. So this stuff really works. And I know that most of you aren't into chasing DXCC right now. That's the DX Century Club. That's an award that you can get through the ARRL for confirming 100 contacts. Kind of a goal for DXers as they're getting started. There's 340 DXCC entities, and hams that have been at this for a while get all excited when they get what's called an ATNO, ATNO, all-time new one. So if you're up to 339 DX confirmed, and you get that 340th, you're jumping up and down. But this probably, so these tricks of doing long path and some of the other things we'll share will become more important to you as you advance in your ham radio career. So here's another example of long path and short path. We've got, in this case, we're having 1, 2, 3 hops, short path. If you go the other direction, come all the way around the Earth the other way.
And I'll just mention on some of the DX spotting websites like DX Heat or the others, in the comments section you'll sometimes see noted LP. That's a clue, long path.
Yeah. We're going to see some propagation prediction software near the end of our presentation tonight where you can actually pick long path or short path that give you the probabilities of making the contact. So it's a real thing. So most contacts are made via short path because there's less distance to travel, less attenuation typically. Long path we talked about. Again, to make the long path contact, point your antenna 180 degrees away from the short path heading. And here's something kind of interesting. A signal may arrive via both long path and short path propagation, resulting in a slightly delayed echo. The reason for the echo is that it takes longer long path than it does short path. And then and the difference would be about 1/7 of a second. Well, depending upon, you know, where you were, how far around the Earth you were. But occasionally you can hear your own signal coming all the way around the world. And the way that works mathematically, human perception is about 1/10 of a second, or 100 milliseconds. And it takes about 140 milliseconds for a signal to get all the way around the Earth, maybe longer because of the number of hops that it has to take. So that is a perceptible delay that you can hear. And I've never heard that, but I know Gary has in the past. It does happen. There's another weird effect. It kind of gets into the paranormal, called long delayed echoes, where signals come back a long time after they're sent. You know, like they're being absorbed in outer space and being repeated by aliens.
I have
or
not
something.
heard those.
No, I've never heard one of those, but there is. It's kind of paranormal, weird stuff, and if you Google on it, you'll hear from people who swear that they've heard these things. So some kind of aliens, I guess. All right, some questions now. See if we absorbed all of this. Which ionospheric region is closest to the surface of the Earth? And give us just a couple seconds before answering, if you would, please.
Alpha.
Alpha, the D region. Yep. What is the approximate maximum distance along the Earth's surface, which is normally covered in one hop using the F2 region?
Charlie. Bravo.
Charlie.
Okay, the F region is 2,500. The E region is 1,200.
yes.
Okay. Speaking of which, they're asking about the distance for the E region. Of course, yeah, that's what we just talked about. Why is skip propagation via the F2 region longer than that via the other ionospheric regions?
Alpha. Charlie.
Charlie, because it's because it's the highest. Yeah, you're going the furthest, so it'll come down further on the other side. What does the term critical angle mean as applied to radio wave propagation? Try to remember my trick here.
Delta.
It is delta, the highest takeoff angle that will return a radio wave to the Earth under specific ionospheric conditions. The reason that that's confusing is they've got just the opposite case here. So that's why this highest trick that I shared with you will work. And to reason that out, it takes some head scratching, but I give you a shortcut. What is meant by the term critical frequency at a given incidence angle?
Alpha.
Yep, the same trick that I shared with you, the highest frequency, which is refracted back to Earth. And based on what we talked about, you can probably reason out why that would be, but you don't have to scratch your head when you see this. Just go for the one with the highest in it. Why is long distance communication on 40 through 160 more difficult during the day?
Charlie.
Charlie, yep. The D region absorbs signals at these frequencies during daylight hours. Which ionospheric region is the most absorbent of signals below 10 megahertz during daylight hours?
Delta.
Delta. Yeah, they come at us different ways here, asking the same thing, but we do have to talk about them all because you could get one. And because these are all in the same group, within the pool structure, you'd probably only get, well, you'd definitely only get one of these if there's multiples that are similar. How is a directional antenna pointed when making a long path contact with another station?
Charlie.
Charlie, 180 degrees away. What is a characteristic of skywave signals arriving at your location by both short path and long path propagation?
Delta.
Yes, a slightly delayed echo may be heard. Yep. All right, we're going to talk about Mr. Sun now and the way that the sun affects propagation. So we've got what are called, notice how happy the sun is, and he's wearing sunglasses. What a good idea that is. So we have what's called the solar cycle. It's approximately an 11-year cycle where there's propagation gets really good and it gets really bad. We're kind of at the peak of what's called solar cycle 25 right now, so we're enjoying phenomenally good conditions for DX. So you'll be getting your general license at a time when you'll have probably a good year or more of great propagation. So the sunspot number represents the number of sunspots present at a given time. These are dark areas on the sun that astronomers look through certain filters to be able to see and count. So they're useful in assessing overall solar activity. So the more active the sun, the more sunspots there are. With more sunspots, you get more ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So higher sunspot numbers generally indicate a greater probability of good propagation at higher frequencies. It's not always the case, but it's usually the case. So here's a picture. We've got solar maximum. Can't really read this, but you see lots of little spots on the sun. And the solar minimum, which was like three or 4 years ago, where you see absolutely no spots on the sun. And here's a blow up, the surface of the sun and compared to the Earth. So during low periods of solar activity, the higher frequency bands, 15, 12, 10, are the least reliable for long distance communications because there's very little ionization in the F layer. Here's just a picture illustrating the 11-year cycle and some notes on what daytime and nighttime bands are good. We won't really go into that, but I just wanted to show you the repetitive nature of propagation at 11-year times. Here we got cycle 21, 22, 23, and of course we're in 25 now. Now the good thing about the 20-meter band is it usually supports worldwide propagation during daylight hours at any point in the solar cycle. So it's a wonderful go-to band when conditions aren't real great. And here's another interesting concept buried within this one. Rotation of the sun's surface layers. That's kind of a weird way to say something, I thought. Rotation of the sun's surface layers around its axis on a 26 to 28 day cycle causes the HF propagation to vary periodically. The reason that they worded it this way is because you would think if the sun was rotating, it would be rotating at the same speeds in the middle and halfway up and at the poles, but that's really not the case. Kastler mentioned that it can be 25 to 35 day rotation at the equator versus the poles, kind of mind-blowing. And he described it as a big ball of squishy gas. So it's kind of a mess up there. That's the reason this is worded kind of funny. But the basic concept is that it causes propagation to vary as it rotates, about a month. Now noise and static, those are the two enemies that you have in working the lower HF bands. In the summer, there's something interesting about the summer, and that's that we have thunderstorms, right? So lower frequencies typically experience high levels of atmospheric noise or static. So that's just true in general, and of course, the lightning and static crashes can really raise havoc with communications. So we have two enemies of propagation on the lower bands. They're absorption, that I mentioned, in the D layer, D region, and static. Here's another interesting concept, solar flux index. This is a measure of solar radiation at 10.7 centimeter wavelength, which is 2800 megahertz, which correlates to sunspots. Well, if you've got sunspots, what do you need the solar flux index for? Because they correlate to one another. And there's a diagram in our book, I think it's page 8-8, but you don't have to go there if you don't want to, that gives the correlation between SFI and sunspots. There is a good reason for having that, though. Sunspots you can only see when the sun is out, okay? So if you're on the daylight side of the Earth, the telescopes and filters can analyze the surface of the sun and give you a sunspot number. If it's cloudy, you can't see the sun. If the sun is on the other side of the Earth, you can't see it. But when the sun's not visible, the solar flux index can still be measured. So this is a useful value. We've got a couple of indices here that we'll talk about. The K index is the short-term stability of Earth's magnetic field. It's a 3-hour average of the stability of Earth's magnetic field. And the other one is called an A index. That one is called the long-term geomagnetic field stability, and it's an average of 8 K index values, or 24 hours. So the previous one, this was a 3-hour average. The K index, the A index is a 24-hour average. And I look at this just about every time I turn on my radio. We'll take a look at some tools where you can see some of these figures. And I only care about the A, because if I'm going to be operating my radio, that's right now. I don't care what it was yesterday or 8 hours ago. If the A index is low, I'm a happy camper. So the values vary over time. And on both of these, I've got the same link. The Space Weather Prediction Center will give you the A and the K index values. And I'll be showing some more detail on that in another section. With that, we'll move on to the next set of questions here. How does a higher sunspot number affect HF propagation?
Alpha.
We have a alpha. Higher sunspot numbers generally indicate a greater probability of good propagation at higher frequencies. There are some other solar effects that can negate that, but this is generally true. Which of the following are least reliable for long-distance communication during periods of low solar activity?
Delta.
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 In other words, which bands really stink? At what point in the solar cycle does the 20-meter band usually support worldwide propagation during daylight hours?
Delta.
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 At any point. So 20 is a good go-to band any time of the solar cycle. What causes HF propagation conditions to vary periodically in a 26 to 28 day cycle?
Charlie.
Charlie, rotation of,
Charlie.
yep, the rotation of the sun's surface layers around its axis. Which of the following is typical of the lower HF frequencies during the summer?
Delta.
It is delta, yeah. What's different in the summer? What's different in the summer is we have thunderstorms, high levels of atmospheric noise or static. What is the solar flux index?
Delta.
That's delta, measure of solar radiation with a wavelength of 10.7 centimeters, about 2,800 megahertz. So that these values are actually measured to generate the index. What does the K index measure?
Bravo.
Bravo, the short-term stability with the Earth's magnetic field. That's the one that I'm most interested in. What does the A index measure?
Charlie.
Yeah, the longer-term stability of the Earth's geomagnetic field. It's interesting to see how things are trending. So if you've got an A index that's really high, but a K that's really low, that means that we're on the backside of something that's clearing up. All right. So we'll continue more on assessing propagation. The sun and propagation assessment are kind of interwoven. Now we'll get into a lot more about MUF and LUF. Believe it or not, there's 6 pool questions related to this. You're only going to get one of them if you get any. But for those that want to get 100% on your exam, it'd be good if you could answer all of these. So MUF is the maximum usable frequency. So think about that for a minute. If that's the maximum usable frequency, a frequency that's higher than that would not be usable. It'd go off into space. So maximum usable frequency for communication between 2 points. It's kind of an important concept because between here and Africa, the MUF, maximum usable frequency, might be different from here to California, for example. So that's why the pool question was worded this way. Frequencies higher than the maximum usable frequency will not be refracted enough to get back to Earth, pass into space. LUF is a different concept, lowest usable frequency. Lowest usable frequency for communication between two specific points. Okay, we had the maximum usable frequency for communication between 2 points. Now we've got the lowest usable frequency. Two different concepts. Frequencies lower than the lowest usable frequency will be attenuated before reaching the destination. Remember the D layer and the absorption effect that it had? That's the reason for that. Frequencies below the maximum usable frequency but above the lowest usable frequency are refracted back to Earth. That's what I call the Goldilocks area. The porridge is not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right, and we get propagation. Now, factors, there's a number of factors that can affect the MUF, and I think this is in all of these coming our way. Path, distance, and location. Okay, time of day and season. Solar radiation and ionospheric disturbances. All of these can cause the maximum usable frequency to be different. Now the frequency that will have the least attenuation for long-distance skip propagation is just below the maximum usable frequency. I've got a picture, bigger picture of this on the next slide, but here we've got the maximum usable frequency, and then the optimum working frequency is just a little bit below that. So if the MUF is 15 megahertz, pick the next lowest ham band, which would be 20 meters. If you knew that the maximum usable frequency was 15, which you can get from websites, then and you were going for DX contacts, you'd probably want to start on 20 meters. Okay, here's a little bit bigger picture. Here's the maximum usable frequency. Notice that it's changing by local time and by frequency. Here's a graph. So you want to operate just a little bit below the maximum usable frequency. And, of course, above the lowest usable frequency. Here's that happy, happy range here. Oh, here's a weird picture. Look at this. The lowest usable frequency actually exceeds the highest usable frequency. Well, that's pretty weird. It does happen, though. When this occurs, there is no propagation. A radio blackout, usually caused by a solar flare, can be caused by a solar flare, an X-ray event, or a geomagnetic storm. I mentioned before that usually when the sunspot numbers are good, we have good propagation. Well, that's not true if there's a geomagnetic storm happening. Now, if LUF, lowest usable frequency, exceeds MUF, maximum usable frequency, propagation via ordinary skywave communication is not possible over the path. And that's diagrammed here. It's easier to see graphically than it is through all of these words. So I added some examples here. We've had students in the past struggle with these concepts a little bit, so I thought this would be helpful, and we've had some positive feedback. Let's assume that the maximum usable frequency is 10 megahertz, which is approximately the 10 meter band.
10 megahertz, 30 meters.
30 meters, right? Yeah, okay. I almost caught Gary there. That's always fun when that happens. So at 10 megahertz, the MUF is 10, the frequency of use is 10. It'll refract some, but just barely because it's on the edge. It's better to be a little bit lower than the MUF. Now, we want to be, if we're above the maximum usable frequency, like if the maximum usable frequency is 10 meters, at 14 megahertz, thank you, 10 megahertz, a 14 megahertz signal would be above the MUF, and it'll just pass into space. It won't return to Earth. Therefore, we will have a sad face if we try to operate on the 20 meter band when the maximum usable frequency is 10. However, if we go to 40 meters, 7 megahertz, we're below the maximum usable frequency. We will refract back to Earth, and we can have a happy time on that band. So these are some examples of maximum usable frequency. Lowest usable frequency, it's just kind of backwards. So we're going to talk about 5 megahertz, which is approximately the 60 meter band. Again, refracts, but just barely. Better to be a little higher than that. And on 80 meters, 3.5, we're below the lowest usable frequency. So we're not going to pass signals. Sad face. Gets absorbed by the ionosphere, will not return to Earth. However, above the lowest usable frequency, if it's 5, if we go to 7 megahertz, 40 meters, we're above the lowest usable frequency, will refract back to Earth, and we got a happy face. So I'm just trying to approach this from different directions to help it make some sense. More on assessing propagation. So what if you want to talk to a location that's distant? How can we, what tools do we have that will help us determine if we're going to have a path to that destination? So to determine current propagation on a desired band from your station, use a network of automated receiving stations on the internet to see where your transmissions are being received. All right, well, these are generic words as they appear in the pool. And then in a practical sense, how can you do this? Well, there's a bunch of tools. Something called PSK Reporter, which there's receiving stations all over the world that will listen to FT8 and other digital modes primarily, and put those on a database that you can access. So you could operate FT8 for 15 or 20 minutes, then go to PSK Reporter and see where you were heard in the world. That would help you determine if there's propagation to that area. Something called the Reverse Beacon Network, primarily used by CW folks. And what it's doing is decoding the CW and indicating signal strength at listening stations all over the world. Something called the WhisperNet, and all of these are links, which will work. WhisperNet, using the Whisper mode, WSPR, that I think we talked about in a previous session, it does the same thing. You send a beacon from your station, a transmission, and WhisperNet stations or Whisper stations around the world, if they hear you, will report the signal strength and put it on their database. Web SDR, that's a concept where you can tune into a receiver someplace else in the world and hear yourself, hear what you're transmitting and see the signal strength. There's something called the Northern California DX Foundation, and here's a little bit more about them down here. They've got listening stations all around the world. I think there's 18 countries represented. There's a little spattering. The world is pretty well covered. So there's actually apps that you can get for your computer or smartphone that know when to listen for these beacons being sent out by this system, Northern California DX Foundation. They've got what's called a beacon project that supports all of this. So that's another one. Another one is FT8 codes. I didn't put a link on this one, but if you have FT8 set up on your computer, you can tell where propagation is coming from around the world, and that will be an indication of propagation being open there. So lots of tools available for doing this. There is a trick that you can use if you don't know CW and you'd like to be able to access the reverse beacon network. You can set up your radio to send a macro. The reverse beacon network is normally listening for CQ and then a call sign, but the word test is also interpreted as something to record. So if you send VVV, VVV is typically just a test signal in CW to let people know that you're just testing, you're not wanting to call them or anything. But I can use VVV, the word test, and then my call sign. If I send that a couple of times, the reverse beacon network will pick that up any place it's heard in the world. Then I can log into their system and see where I was heard. So you don't necessarily need to know CW in order to send that message. You just set it up as a macro and then send it from your transmitter. So that's a trick that you can use. The reverse beacon network is very powerful. A lot of features. So there's some software prediction tools that are really good. One tip I think was in our books is short skip skywave propagation on the 10-meter band may be a good indicator of skywave propagation on the 6-meter band. So if you see that the 10-meter band is just hopping, wouldn't hurt to check 6 meters. You may have propagation there as well. There's a couple of propagation prediction software tools that are just fabulous. VOACAP is one. We're going to have a demo of that a little bit later. That stands for Voice of America Coverage Analysis Program. As Gary likes to say, it's your tax dollars at work. It's been available for some time. The other one is called Propi. I don't know if that stands for anything, but it's just another tool that predict propagation. And there's all kinds of videos on YouTube. I've got a couple of links here if you want to investigate this further. Another thing you can do, if you call CQ on a dead band, this can be amazing. The band might be open, but nobody thought to try it. So sometimes if you'll send CQ on a supposedly dead band, you can get responses from faraway places. These are just tricks that you can use to help predict where propagation might be possible. Another thing that I like to do, FT8 can be used as a propagation indicator. These are the standard FT8 frequencies for 160 through 6 meters. And what I've done is program these into my transceiver. Most modern transceivers will allow you to program frequencies into them. And in my case, on my ICOM 7610, all I have to do is just rotate a knob, and I can quickly step through this in about 15 seconds. I can briefly listen to each one of these frequencies. And FT8 is so popular that if there's propagation available to you from any place, you're going to hear a bodacious signal coming in on these frequencies. So that's just a really quick way to tell what's going on. If 6 meters is totally dead on the FT8 frequencies, I wouldn't bother trying. So then that's a trick that's very easy to do. You can carry that one step further, and if you've got FT8 set up and you actually look at the decodes that are happening, here we're just listening to the RF frequency to see if there's activity, but if you actually have FT8 set up for decode, you can actually tell where the propagation is open to at that time. Like on 10 meters, for example, tune there, find out that you're hearing all South America. On 15 meters, maybe you're hearing all of Europe. So that's a good way to tell what might be open and where. So this would be an awesome time for a break. Next, we're going to be going through a few more aspects of the sun. So let's take our break at this time. So we'll take a 5-minute break and come back and chat a little bit more about Mr. Sun. 5 minutes. Okay, we're back again. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about section 8.2 in our book. And this little piece will be about the sun. So we've already seen a diagram that looks similar to this one. So we have ionizing radiation that we've talked about. So ionization is normally a good thing. But when we get excessive ionization, as in the case of solar flares or coronal mass injections or magnetic storms, we get something called disturbed conditions. There's several pool questions that will describe something dire and ask you what that results in, and the answer is usually disturbed conditions. So just kind of remember that as a crutch, 'cause we'll see it several times. So extreme high levels of ionization can cause radio blackouts, and you'll turn on your radio and you'll say, did my antenna fall down? Well, sometimes your antenna actually will fall down, but in this case, you'll think it fell down and it didn't. We're in a radio blackout. We're also there's another principle that'll be important to help with the pool questions. We've got the speed of light, which is about 8 minutes to get from the sun to the earth. And then we have what I'm going to call the speed of particles, where junk coming off the surface of the sun, as Kessler called it, particles, they can take between 15 and 20, 25 hours. I've got a number coming up. But the speed of light versus the speed of particles will help answer some questions if you just kind of set that aside as a concept. So solar disturbances, and I searched quite a while before I could find a picture of a disturbed ostrich. That's what this is over here. So a solar flare is a large eruption of X-ray and UV energy in solar material on the surface of the sun. Now, solar flare, that's light, okay? So it's going to come at us at the speed of light. It'll take about 8 minutes to get here from the sun. A coronal hole is a weak area of the sun's outer layer where ionized gas and charged particles escape the sun's magnetic field. Here we're dealing with the speed of particles. That can be 10 to 20 to 40 hours. Kessler calls it junk, sun junk. Coronal mass ejection is another one. Ejection of large amounts of material from the corona, speed of particles. So it's just solar flares that we've identified so far that comes at us at the speed of light. All of these can disturb HF communications. So solar flare, coronal hole, CME, these will disturb HF communications. All right. So UV and X-ray radiation from a solar flare affect radio propagation on the Earth in approximately 8 minutes. It was the speed of light we were talking about. A solar flare is also called sudden ionospheric disturbance, or SID, not to be confused with sudden infant death syndrome. But in radio, I guess you could say it's the same idea. Increased D-region ionization and absorption. The solar flare increases D-region ionization and absorption dramatically, can cause a radio blackout, can last from seconds to hours. Very weird effect. I've only seen it once or twice, but it definitely happens. A sudden ionospheric disturbance affects lower frequencies more than higher frequencies. And the next point kind of goes, it's reasonable, as SID only impacts the sunny side of the Earth because the dark side of the Earth, opposite of the sun, can't see that light coming its way because the Earth is shielding it. And we'll talk about particle disturbances, geomagnetic disturbances. These particles that come off the sun are charged, magnetically charged. And these particles are what's known as the solar wind. Coronal mass injections can take 15 hours to several days to reach the Earth because it's particles coming our way. Charged particles from solar coronal holes disturb HF communications. And the word disturb is going to show up and will be a clue in the answers. Particles, and now this is the one exception where it can be maybe a little bit of a good thing. So particles increase ionization in the E region, cause auroral displays and geomagnetic storms. But this increased ionization in the E region near the poles of the Earth can provide a propagation path on VHF. Here's a picture of a visible aurora. Not the same as what we experience that affects radio, but it's caused by the same effect from the sun. So here we've got a solar flare. This is the Earth, and of course it's a long ways away. It almost looks like the sun is having a baby in this picture. This one here, coronal hole, large coronal hole in a CME. There's a very interesting image or video here on the NASA site that, or the site that's referenced to NASA, about a solar flare in progress. We won't take time to look at that, but it's pretty interesting if you care to look at it on your own. But the pictures are spectacular of some of these things. So more on solar disturbances. First of all, let's consider the Earth. The Earth has got a magnetic north and south pole. So here's a picture of a bar magnet lined up on the Earth, and these are magnetic lines of force. Now, because we have a north pole and a south pole, if we have magnetically charged particles coming from the Earth, they will be attracted, opposite values will be attracted to the north and south poles. So a geomagnetic storm is a temporary disturbance in Earth's geomagnetic field due to charged particles coming from the sun. Geomagnetic storm degrades, here we've got something being degraded again. Geomagnetic storm degrades high latitude HF propagation. So it hurts propagation. Propagation may be wiped out for a period of hours to days. And there are sites that you can go to that will tell you if we're in the midst of a geomagnetic storm. So if you think your antenna fell down, check one of these sites. Now auroras, here I've got a visual. We don't normally see these in South Carolina. If you're in northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, it's not that unusual for these to occur. So it's a glow of gases caused by incoming charged particles as they flow into the atmosphere, guided by the Earth's magnetic field, which is why they're at the northern or extreme southern latitudes. Most of us don't live near the South Pole, though, so we will normally only be concerned about the northern lights. So, but here's the one exception. A benefit of geomagnetic activity can create auroras that can reflect VHF signals. Not a great benefit because the signals are distorted and fluttery sounding, but it is a positive impact. Everything else about them is negative. So auroral propagation is strongest on 6 and 2 meters, but it's accompanied by a hissing and buzzing sound. All right, it was a short section, just the end of the previous one that we were in. So jump into some questions. What does LUF stand for? LUF.
Alpha.
Alpha. Lowest usable frequency for communication between two specific points. Now the LUF and the MUF one both indicate between two specific points, so that might be another thing that you can look for in the answers. What does MUF stand for?
Bravo.
Bravo. Okay, that's correct. Maximum usable frequency. What factor or factors affect the maximum usable frequency?
Delta.
It is delta. All of those. What usually happens to radio waves with frequencies below the LUF?
Charlie.
It is Charlie. The lowest usable frequency, if we're below that, they're not going to go anywhere. They're attenuated before reaching the destination. How does the ionosphere affect radio waves with frequencies below the MUF and above the LUF? To think about this one a little bit.
Alpha.
It is alpha. That's the Goldilocks region. They are refracted back to Earth. What happens to HF propagation when the LUF exceeds the MUF?
Alpha.
It is alpha. Propagation via ordinary skywave communications is not possible over that path. Which frequency will have the least attenuation for long-distance skip propagation?
Charlie.
No, it's actually, yeah, it is alpha just below the maximum usable frequency. The maximum usable frequency is right on the edge, so higher than that, the signal's not going to go anywhere. So you want to be a little bit below that. Which of the following is a way to determine current propagation on a desired band from your station? I gave you a whole bunch of them, but there's just one in the pool. Well, no, use a network of automated receiving stations on the internet to see where your transmissions are being received. So which of the following, okay. Now the A index, that's the long-term stability, which doesn't really tell you about propagation, it just tells you that conditions are disturbed. So that's why it's not Bravo. Approximately how long does it take the increased ultraviolet and X-ray radiation from a solar flare to affect radio propagation on Earth?
Charlie.
Charlie. Yep, the solar flare, that's light. Light takes 8 minutes to get to us from the sun. What effect does a sudden ionospheric disturbance have on daytime ionospheric propagation?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Yeah, it is Bravo. It disrupts signals on lower frequencies more than those on higher frequencies. How long does it take a coronal mass ejection to affect radio propagation on the Earth?
Charlie? Or
Delta.
It's a long time. If you can kind of think of that, takes a long time. 15 hours is the biggest one. Oh no, actually 14 days is bigger than that. Well, okay, so it's 15 hours. I was trying to give you a shortcut, and my shortcut didn't work.
I always think of 1 day, 24 hours.
Yeah. That would be a better shortcut. What is a geomagnetic storm?
Charlie.
Well, delta is actually the answer. A temporary disturbance in Earth's geomagnetic field. Yeah, we didn't really talk about ripples. Yeah, it was a disturbance.
They have ridges.
Actually, yeah. Actually, no. Okay, so temporary disturbance. Remember, something bad is a disturbance was the shortcut I tried to share. What can a geomagnetic storm, or how can a geomagnetic storm affect HF radio propagation?
Delta.
It is delta, degrade high latitude HF propagation. It wouldn't really have an effect on ground wave. That was the other degrade. How is long distance communication usually affected by the charged particles that reach the Earth from the solar coronal holes?
Bravo.
Bravo?
Well, it's Bravo. Yeah, remember that the word disturbed. Anytime something bad is going to happen, something is going to be disturbed. That'll help you with 3 or 4 pool questions. How can high geomagnetic activity benefit radio communications? That was the one exception we talked about.
Bravo.
No.
Alpha?
Alpha, yeah, creates auroras that can reflect VHF signals. Yep. And for that to work, you've got to be pointing your antenna north because you're shooting for the poles. Okay, now we're going to talk about scatter modes, and then we're going to get into some supplemental information beyond that I think you'll find to be very, very helpful. Scatter modes is a fairly short section. So, ionospheric reflections. We saw a diagram that was similar to this previously. It was just kind of going up and coming back down again. And that was a skip zone. From the place where ground wave communication stops, that's one boundary, to where the skip comes down is the other boundary, and that's the skip zone. But sometimes it's possible for signals to be heard inside the skip zone. And those are usually due to what's called scatter. scatter effects. Notice these little things that are kind of, it looks like they're leaking, right? they're leaking off the main wave. That might be a good way to think of them too, because the leaks are fairly small, but because there are changes in electron density here, there will be a little bit of scatter effect that happens as we cross these boundaries before we get up to the main refraction and come back down. So these are called scatter effects, and this leakage from the main path, if you want to call it that, will come down in the skip zone. You shouldn't be able to hear anything there, but sometimes you can. It's usually weak because not very much of the signal is coming down via that method. Here we've got some coming from the E layer, some from the F1 layer. Usually when you talk about this effect, it's usually the E layer that we're talking about. So this is the signal is going up. It comes down to the received station, and then it's going to bounce from there. So we can get an effect called backscatter. This, I guess you could call forward scatter, although it's not called that, coming down this way. But backscatter, which is a real term, that happens when it hits the ground and bounces back up again, and can scatter here off the E layer into the skip zone. So it's ways that we can get into the skip zone, but they're kind of unpredictable. It's like there's little clouds of electrons that form in the E layer. Nobody really knows why, but when they do, that can cause the E scatter effect. Another thing that can occur, we talked about maximum signal on short path and the possibility of receiving a signal via long path. Well, some people have observed that when they can't get through, they'll point a beam antenna slightly off axis and be able to communicate. I'm pretty sure that that's because they're invoking some kind of an E scatter effect. Yep, our good friend Matt, NU4E, commented the other day that occasionally when he's trying to work a skid and he can't get them on short path or a long path, he'll go about 30 degrees off axis and make the contact. This is probably why that works. The E scatter is not really predictable. There's clouds of electrons that form in the E layer. Nobody really knows why. So sometimes you can communicate on purpose that way. Here's a picture here of some electron clouds being shown. E layer, we've got the antenna coming up. Normally it would go up and come down and miss this station, but in this case it'll come down and be heard in the skip zone. So scatter propagation allows signals to be heard in the transmitting station's skip zone, too far away to be received by ground wave, but too near for skip. So you just can be really happy when that happens because it's very difficult to predict. Backscatter, I mentioned, will reflect a signal back toward the transmitter when it comes down to the ground near the station that's listening to you. So backscatter helps fill the skip zone when signals would otherwise not be heard. Here's a little picture of how it works. The ionosphere is not all clean and pristine and nice clean lines like it's usually shown. So here we've got reflected rays. We got rays coming up, and they're depending upon where they hit this boundary in the E layer, they can come down in all different ways. You can see it's just a scatter in all directions. Kind of a big mess, which is why it's normally weak and fluttery. So scatter characteristics, signals tend to be weak. Only a small part of the signal energy is scattered into the skip zone. Typically have a fluttering sound because of all of this weird stuff going on. Often sounds distorted. Energy is being scattered into the skip zone through several different paths, resulting in multipath interference. Then there's something called near vertical incident skywave. Great big funny term. A lot of people call it NVIS or NVIS is its nickname. Short distance MF or HF propagation using high elevation angles. I think I've got a bigger picture of that here. Yes, I do. So here's our transmitting station, and we're shooting the signal almost straight up. Not quite, but close to straight up. And if the frequency and the relationships are proper, it can come back down again. Now notice between our transmitting antenna and a receiving antenna over here, we wouldn't be able to go through the mountain and get there. Kastler has this problem in Colorado. They have a statewide net that they run using NVIS antennas. The idea is that it'll go up, it'll hop over the mountain and come back down again. So this is about a 30-mile, 50-kilometer, 30-some-mile distance, as shown in our diagram, that gives you good communication throughout that whole area using this form of skip. The military uses this as well. And the way that you get that to work is, let me back up, I think I've got it, yeah. Okay, so it's reflections from a signal using high elevation angles scattered back to Earth over a short range around the transmitting station. We saw that from the diagram. And the best antenna to use is a low dipole, because when a dipole is mounted at less than a quarter wavelength high, it tends to become omnidirectional, especially at very high angles. So it's shooting a lot of its energy up into the sky, which some people refer to as a cloud burner antenna. And it works best at 40 meters and lower frequencies. And there was our picture again. All right, and a few questions, then we'll get into our supplemental material. What type of propagation allows signals to be heard in the transmitting station's skip zone?
Bravo.
It is Bravo. That's friend scatter. What is a characteristic of HF scatter?
Bravo. Bravo.
Yep, signals have a they're weak and fluttery. What makes HF scatter signals often sound distorted?
Delta.
It is delta. Energy is scattered into the skip zone through several different paths, kind of a multi-path distortion effect. Why are HF scatter signals in the skip zone usually weak?
Alpha.
Alpha, yep. Only a small part of the signal energy is scattered into the skip zone. What is near vertical incident skywave, or NVIS, propagation?
Bravo.
It is Bravo. Short distance MF or HF propagation at high elevation angles. Okay, so this that concludes the part that address the pool questions, or our chapter. The next several minutes, I've got some material that I think will be really helpful to you, or at least interesting. So we'll move on to that. First of all, some more information. At this stage in your ham radio career, most of you are not generals yet, so you're probably not interested in more information about these subjects. But as you grow and become interested in chasing DX and awards related to DX, this will be of more interest to you. Understanding Ham Radio Propagation. This is by Michael Burnett. I gave him credit when we were doing our Learning How to Learn presentation. He's a very entertaining speaker. I was privileged to hear him at Dayton a year or two ago. Just a really fun guy to listen to, and he writes the same way that he speaks. So that this is more readable of the two references. The other one is a little bit more technical, here to there, radio wave propagation. It's more technical, and it's only been out for about a little over a year, but these are both really good resources, so I wanted to share those. And these are links to Amazon. These are both available as Kindle books, by the way, too. And Kindle does they have a major incentive to authors to keep their Kindle prices under $10. So these are both $9.99 on Kindle. Now, I've mentioned this before, and there's just a wealth of resources. You'll see this kind of diagram all over the place as you're going through people's QRZ pages, QRZ.com, the reference site. There's a panel that shows this. And Paul Herman puts this together. And there's several resources here. We'll just look at one or two of them along the way. But there's a couple of things that I look at just about every time I turn on my radio. One is the K index. Remember I talked about the A index and the K index? Well, in this case, K is 1. I love it when K is 0 or 1, very low. And that will normally correlate, it says geomagnetic field, very quiet. that's what you want. If the geomagnetic field is very quiet and you've got fairly high SFI, or sunspot numbers, I consider high numbers to be anything in triple digits. So if I see triple digit SFI and sunspot number in a low K, I know that I stand a pretty good chance of having some pretty good conditions if I'm interested in doing DX. Now, of course, on the lower bands, static and that kind of stuff can still hurt you, but that gives me an idea. And here's a current picture of the sun. So here's his site. Let me turn off my pointer so that this will work. That should pop up. Yeah. Is this going out, Gary?
Yes.
Okay, good. So here's the panel that I showed you. And these update about once an hour. And another feature I like about this is that it'll tell you, it'll give you a propagation prediction. Right now it's daytime. So it says on these bands, the propagation is probably going to be pretty good. And at night, these bands are going to be pretty good. So that's helpful too to look at. So we've got all kinds of, he makes the code available that you can copy and put on your QRZ page if you want, or if you've got a ham radio website. He doesn't charge for this, but he accepts donations. So these are just samples of different kinds of panels that you can download the code and actually make them work on your website if you care to. So another resource that he has, I'll click this next link. Find my mouse, all right. Understanding current conditions. Now, you see all of these parameters listed on his propagation panel. What do they all mean? Well, this is a link that kind of describes in a little bit more detail what some of these things mean. So it's helpful to dig a little bit deeper there. There was a fella, coming back to my presentation here, who was very confused by all of these numbers, all of this data. We'll get into more of these in the extra class, but because he didn't really understand them, he wanted to do a bunch of research and find out what they meant, and then his intention was to write an article explaining it all. So I'll just show you that quick. It's about a multiple page document that goes through and gives you some amount of detail about what these different parameters mean and how you can use them. And NOAA, National Oceanic, can't speak, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration also has some resources that talk about some of these solar numbers. So I wanted these to be available to you. But understanding how this panel works is helpful. I already gave you the clue, triple digit SFI and sunspot, and low K usually means happiness. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about, I want to demonstrate one of the propagation tools that we mentioned, and I'll do it in the context of a real-world situation, or problem, if you want to call it that I have. Okay, so I do a lot of parks on the air. Hunted quite a few. I've activated parks in about I think 15 states. As I'm traveling around, I like to do that, and the Parks on the Air site has a area where they keep track of all of that for you, so you can do it. But I don't have Alaska. Alaska and I think Wyoming. I've never worked a park in Alaska or Wyoming. So how can I use propagation prediction software to maybe help me with that? There's a little picture here from the Parks on the Air mapping tool that shows most of the parks in Alaska are all in about the same place. They're all right around Fairbanks. So there's a tool here, which I can click on. I think we have time.
You might want to turn on your laser pointer for the folks on YouTube.
Okay. The trick is I can't click links with that on, but once I'm in it, though, I can. Okay. Yeah, good suggestion, Gary.
Well, they can see that, I guess.
There we go. Yep. So that's where we were. And this is the site that I'm going to be going to. So this is going to come up right now because we are in South Carolina. It's going to be showing things around where we are, Simpsonville and Woodruff and so forth. But for DX entity, I can put in Alaska here. And that's really helpful, isn't it? Well, let me zoom out. Here we go. So here's Alaska, and here you can see that all of the sites are really, oh, I don't remember the state or city. It's at Anchorage, though, is the, so most of the population is around here, and that's where most of the parks are. So there should be a good number of folks that, if they're into parks on the air, would be trying to work in those areas. So the next question that I'll ask here, let me get our laser going again.
You're okay, you don't need it.
Oh, is this showing up?
Yeah.
Okay. The next thing that I'm going to want to know is I know where the parks are, and for propagation software, I'm going to want to know the grid square for Anchorage. It happens to be BP51BF, and I know where my grid square is, so I won't look that one up, but let's see if I can make this work. Oh, we got to switch this off. There we go. So this is a little hard to see, but this is a tool. Let me see if I can make this bigger. There we go. Okay, so locator. For locator, I'm going to click in address, and I'm going to say Anchorage, Alaska. All right, and it gives me this very helpful information here that says Anchorage, Alaska. The grid square is BP51BF. So now I know where it is I'm wanting to reach, and I know where my location is. So let me exit out of this. Now the next thing that we're going to consider is what time of day are we interested in? Well, for both parks on the air and summits on the air, people have to get up in the morning, pack up their equipment, and drive to the location that they want to activate. So most of the activity is around between noon and 3 p.m. in Alaska. That works out to between 4 and 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I'm assuming that I'm going to want to work somebody from home. Now, everything in the propagation tool works in UTC, Universal Coordinated Time. That works out to 2000 or 2000 and 2300 UTC. So these are the times that I'm going to want to put into the propagation software, and I already know what the grid squares are that I'm interested in. So the next thing I want to do is go to VOACAP, Propagation Prediction Tool. And that comes up and looks something like this. Now what I've done, I did this earlier today, I went ahead and put in some assumptions about the antennas that might be in use. Is this visible, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay, put in the information about the antennas. I assumed low height, maybe 15-foot dipoles, the person at the park, and I put in the antennas that I use at home over here, and then that will cause some predictions to occur. VOACAP will consider all kinds of factors in predicting this path. You'll also notice another feature here. See this dotted line, red dotted line? It goes here and it actually comes up. Okay, this is long path. So we can actually predict the chances of a propagation, a contact via propagation via short path or long path. Very interesting and powerful tool. The next thing that I'm going to do is there's a tool called CAP wheel. Okay, coverage area predictor, and that's this picture over here. Now, using the antennas that I have at home and the antenna I'm assuming that they're using at the park, we can tell by the colors here which bands and what times we are likely to make a contact. Well, you'll notice that the one that is most orange, see the scale goes from 0, which is no color at all the way up through red, which your chances are 100%. So it looks like during the hours that we're interested in, which were 2,000 and 2,300, it looks like the most brightly colored band that we've got is 17 meters. And I'm assuming CW here and 100 watts. So it looks like 17 meters is the best shot. And if I put my mouse here, it'll tell us in the middle that 2300 universal time on 17 meters, I've got an 80% chance of making that contact. So that would be my best shot. Why CW? Because I do most of my stuff in CW. Well, what if I was going to use FT8? Okay, we've got an 80% chance here. Let me come over here and switch the mode to FT8. See if things changed. Oh, they got brighter. So we're seeing that we jumped up to an 87% chance. Now I'm gonna do something that might be very discouraging to some of you online. I'm going to switch to single sideband. Eek! All right, now our chances just dropped to what is it, 47%. So it's still doable, but big difference between FT8 and CW versus sideband. Now Gary, I only have the capability of running 100 watts from home. Gary has got the capability of doing 1,500 watts. So let's bump this up to 1,500 and see things got much better.
We have to do it 20 dB better in single sideband.
Yeah, 20 dB, it's a huge difference. So another thing that I've heard said is that a real, how does that go? It takes a real man to make contacts like this on single, or woman, make contacts on single sideband. It's a lot more difficult, takes a lot more energy. So I just kind of wanted to describe some of that. Gary'd be a little bit better because I think his antenna is, I was assuming a dipole here. So the antennas can be set up, but I just wanted to give you a little picture of what you can do with some of this propagation software. You can do this for anywhere in the world. Let's do one more thing and go from short path to long path. Okay, kind of take a mental picture of the colors here. Now we'll switch from short path to long path, and things really got dismal there. So long path doesn't look like it's going to, it looks like our brightest color is going to be, let's see, blue. Okay, there's some green here, but even that is down below 30%. So long path wouldn't be a way to go. So I just wanted to pull some of these things together for us in terms of how this could be done practically. All right, we saw that. Here's a picture of time zones. I didn't go through the detail of how we came up with the times, but that's all available online. Showed you what we did here, and our best chance was on 17 or 20 meters. And then finally, what I want to do is just introduce Tamitha Skov. She's a ham. I don't know if she's active on the air or not. She usually is at Hamvention in Dayton. And I've seen her there, but she's called the Space Weather Woman. She's got a website that has all kinds of information about her work. She's a doctorate in this kind of science. And she puts out something called a space forecast. I downloaded, or I got the link today for the most recent one, which is actually a couple weeks old now, space forecast. And it just kind of, you've seen forecasts on television where they tell you, the storms that are coming and is it going to rain or snow or, what's going to happen. Well, she does the same thing, but in a space weather context. So what I wanted to do was just show you a couple of little clips from her most recent forecast.
We're in a big pocket of fast solar wind with more coming. And We've got lots of regions
sun going
rotating
okay?
into Earth view
Okay,
from the
good.
sun's far side, and that means big flare and big solar storm risk is
Wait
rising.
a few seconds of this.
Those stories and more are in this week's Spotlight. If you want to learn how weather from our star causes impacts at the Earth that shape the future of our world, join Professors Dr. Jenny Meehan, Michael Cook,
Pause this and move it forward.
and
Get another piece of it.
is keeping us on the busy side. As we take a look at our Earth-facing disk, we haven't gotten a lot of activity in terms of big solar flares. However, we have been storming quite a bit, and it's mainly due to some fast solar wind from multiple coronal holes. In fact, you can see one here that's rotating to the sun's west limb. The fast solar wind from this coronal hole, along with a stealthy solar storm that was kind of in the mix, actually bumped us up to G2 storm levels over the last few days and actually gave us some decent aurora clear down to mid-latitudes. That calmed down, but now our focus is shifting to this coronal hole. This one has now begun to give us some fast solar wind. We've been storming at G1 levels over the last 24 hours or so, and it will continue to do that over the next day before things kind of settle down just a little bit. And then our focus will shift to this coronal hole, and we're going to get some fast wind from that one as well. And likely that G1 storming is going to continue periodically, although it's going to dim down just a little bit. Plus the fact that we're at the equinox, that really bumps up the chances for getting storm levels. So aurora photographers, wow, you've been enjoying some great views, including possibly aurora with a blood moon because we had that lunar eclipse.
So you can kind of see what's happening here. She's giving a forecast in terms of the solar conditions. Let me jump forward to one more section. Or she'll be talking about ham radio. Let's see, 12, 13.
And this is at flight level 360 for you aviators. It's also the S0 quiet range for everybody else. NOAA's only giving us about a 1% chance of a radiation storm at the S1, S2 level, which is basically zero essentially. And that might rise to about 5% as we move in through the latter part of this week because we're going to start getting some of those regions rotating to the sun's west limb. But overall, everything is staying pretty much in the green. So if you're a frequent flyer, and this does include aircrew or your high-risk passengers, well, it looks like you're going to be all in the clear. So the space weather this week is keeping us on our toes. We have quite a few pockets of fast solar wind that keep hitting Earth. That means we're getting lots of chances for aurora. If you're at high latitudes and you're an aurora photographer, you're in luck. You could be getting shows all week before things begin to calm down. Aurora photographers at mid latitudes, well, the aurora may not be quite so bright for you, and you're going to be fighting that bright moon. So only if you're dedicated should you chase. Now, amateur radio operators and emergency responders, while you've been enjoying a bit of quiet time on Earth's day side, we haven't had to worry too much about radio blackouts, but things are going to be changing here over the next week and possibly 2 weeks. We're definitely getting a lot more active regions in Earth view, and some of them are big returning regions. So expect the noise on the bands to continue creeping up, and expect the risk for radio blackouts to continue to rise. And now you GPS users, well, you may not be liking the night side very much right now because we do have ongoing aurora that's causing scintillation risk to really rise for you. So definitely.
So that gives you a little idea who Tamitha Skov is, and her forecasts are really a lot of fun. I've got some links here that I've put up for you if you want to investigate that a little bit further. But I thought it was fascinating that we could get a weather forecast just like we can get on our news channels. Say again?
We can't see your links.
My links, okay.
You said you had links.
All right, how do I get back to, oh, I know why. Hang on. There we go. All right. You got them now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yep. Here's the links. Yep. I accidentally jumped out of the presentation. So here's the forecast. This one goes back to March 14th. She puts these up every week or two, so this one is a little bit outdated, but she was sharing information that was going into the next 2 weeks. She's really a lot of fun to listen to. I just wanted to make you aware of these resources, and here's her main site. So that was the supplemental information that I wanted to share with you, introduce you to Tamitha, show you a propagation tool and some resources on how to read the propagation panels that you see all over the internet. So that's it for me for tonight. So we can jump into class chat if you want to, Gary, and we'll talk about next week as well.
Any comments or questions?
I have a question about the propagation prediction tools. Generally, how accurate are they? I know they give you a percentage and all that, but how accurate would you say they are?
Well, maybe our Voice of America guy can comment.
Well, it was developed, for VOA in order to put programs onto a target area with higher reliability. It's developed over time. Confidence levels are high, as they say, but it's not 100%.
Right.
Okay.
It's all based
Okay.
on probabilities, and the ionosphere is continually shifting. So it's the best that we have, and it's usually pretty good.
Great, thank you.
Question.
Sure.
They were talking about the high winds and stuff coming off the solar flares.
Yep.
Is that what's causing all the high winds that are coming into lower levels?
No, those are solar winds. So that's stuff that we never see down at our level. Yep.
But good question.
Very good question.
Good news is that the
Yeah.
winds are picking up more and more.
Yeah. No, that doesn't have anything, as far as we know, with having to do with solar effects.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Very interesting stuff here.
All right, well, next week, last chapter in the book, safety. We'll be talking about that, and I will be doing my best to convince you that ham radio is an adventure. So you'll see how that ties in. And also then we will take a practice test next week together, a 35-question actual test generated by the ARRL website, and we'll see how we do as a group. You will grade your own paper. You don't have to share. So we're almost done. There's only one more class session after next week. So great to have you all with us.
And then the farmer's market stuff.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got your summer vacation. All right.
It's not that hard, gentlemen.
You can do
and
it.
ladies.
All right.
Yep, we'll
See you
all.
next week.
Thank you very much.
73.
Yep.
73.
Gary. Gary?